Cole Mercer had been standing on the shoulder of Highway 9 for 40 minutes when the blue Subaru slowed down, and he hadn't waved at it, hadn't stuck out a thumb. He hadn't done anything except stand there in his good black dress shirt with his phone dead in his pocket and the taste of church coffee still in the back of his throat. The car stopped anyway. The window came down, and the woman behind the wheel looked at him, the way someone looks at a word they recognize but can't quite place, not alarmed, not curious, just reading. She had dark hair pulled back in a way that said she'd done it in a parking lot 5 minutes ago, sunglasses pushed up on her head, and a lanyard from what looked like a conference badge still looped around the gear shift. She said, "You need a ride," and her voice was level, not loud, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry. Cole looked at the road in both directions, as if another option might be coming. Nothing was coming. He said, "I'm going to Selden, about 30 miles east." She said, "Get in." And nothing in her face suggested this was a debate she intended to have. He got in. The car smelled like pine air freshener and old French fries and something faintly floral, maybe the jacket folded on the back seat. She checked her mirror before she pulled out. And Cole buckled his seatbelt and set his dead phone on his knee and watched the highway open up ahead of them. A mile passed. He thought she would ask what happened. "Why are you out here? Was there an accident?" The usual questions strangers asked when they stopped for someone on a shoulder. She didn't ask. She turned the radio down to almost nothing, barely a murmur, and drove. He noticed she didn't turn it off entirely. He just brought it down to a frequency that was more like texture than sound. It occurred to him that this was an unusually considerate thing to do and that he hadn't deserved it. After another mile, he said, "I should tell you I'm not dangerous." She glanced over at him, a quick sideways look that lasted about 2 seconds, and said, "I figured." He said, "How?" she said. "You buckled your seatbelt before you even said thank you." He didn't have anything to say to that. They drove in silence for 3 miles that felt like 6. Cole watched the landscape come and go, dry hills, a billboard for a mattress store, a water tower with the town name faded almost to nothing. He was trying not to think about the church, the folding chairs, the way his aunt had gripped his arm at the graveside as if he might fall, and he'd had to hold himself very still to communicate that he wasn't going to fall, that he was fine, that he'd been fine for 6 years and intended to stay that way. He was doing a good job of not thinking about it. Then the woman said, without preamble, "I'm not taking you home yet." And Cole turned his head and looked at her. She was watching the road. "There's something I need to stop for," she said. "It'll take maybe 40 minutes. If that's a problem, I can call you a ride share from wherever we stop." He said, "I don't have a charger." She said, "I have a charger." He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." A beat passed, and he said, "You're very calm about having a stranger in your car." She said, "You're very calm about getting into a stranger's car." He said, "Fair enough." A small thing crossed her mouth, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, and she reached down and turned the radio up 1 notch. Still quiet, but no longer apologetic. Her name was Mara, she told him without being asked, somewhere around the 20-minute mark. When they'd established through careful banter that he was an electrician, she worked in disaster coordination. And neither of them particularly liked the stretch of this highway because of the way the guardrails were too low on the north side. Cole told her his name in return, and she nodded the way people nod when they hear a name that sounds like it belongs to the situation. He said, "What kind of disaster coordination?" she said. "The kind where things have already gone wrong and we're trying to stop them from going wronger." He said, "Is wronger a technical term?" she said. "It's in the handbook." He said, "There's a handbook," she said. "There's always a handbook. Nobody reads it." He almost laughed, and the almost laugh caught him off guard because he had not been expecting to almost laugh today. He covered it by looking out the window. The hills were starting to give way to something greener, lower, which meant they were heading toward water, which meant she was not going east, which meant she was not taking him home. He let it go for another 5 minutes, watching the roads change, watching the turnoffs go by that would have pointed them toward Selden. Then he said, "We're not going east," she said. "No," he said. "You said you had to stop somewhere," she said. "I do," he said, where she was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone buying time, but the silence of someone deciding how much of an answer is actually an answer. She said, "A place I go sometimes." He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He said, "That's not really a location," she said. "No, it's not," he said. "And you're not going to give me one," she said. "I'll give you a charger. Your phone will be on by the time we get there." He said, "That's not the same thing," she said. "I know." And she said it with such complete serenity that Cole found he did not actually want to argue with it. He leaned his head back against the headrest and looked at the ceiling of the car, which had a small scuff mark near the light fixture that looked like it had been made by a surfboard or a very long umbrella, and he thought, "I just got into a car with a woman who won't tell me where she's taking me. And the most alarming thing about this is that I don't particularly mind." The charger was in the console between the seats, a tangle of cables that she gestured at without looking. He found the right connector and plugged in his phone and watched the charging symbol appear. And for the first time since the funeral director had said what funeral directors say, he felt something that wasn't weight. It was a small thing. A phone charging. It shouldn't have mattered. It did. Mara kept driving. Outside the windows, the road was narrowing. The signs were becoming more local and less interstate. And somewhere off to the left, there was the flat gleam of water beginning to show through the trees. Cole watched the water through the trees and tried to remember the last time he'd been near a lake. He thought it might have been a camping trip in his mid-20s. The kind of trip that seemed like a good idea in February and became a wet, mosquito-heavy argument by July. He'd been with a girl named Dana then, and they'd broken up in the car on the way back. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way people end things when they've run out of reasons to continue and can't remember clearly why they began. He thought about Dana sometimes without pain, which he understood was the mark of something that had ended correctly. He was less sure about other things. He was less sure about the 6 years of phone calls not made and visits not taken, and a man who had apparently spent the last 18 months asking his sister to pass along the message that Cole should call when he felt ready. And Cole hadn't called, and now the man was in the ground outside a white church in a town Cole had barely recognized. And the window for readiness had closed permanently without Cole walking through it. He pressed the heel of his hand against his knee and made himself look at the road instead of the water. Mara said, "You're doing that thing," he said. "What thing?" she said. "The thing where you make your face very still so nothing gets in or out." He stared at her. She was watching the road, but there was a quality to her profile that suggested she'd already seen everything she needed to see from her peripheral vision. He said, "How long have you been watching me?" she said. "I'm driving. I can't watch you. I just notice things." He said, "That's a very fine distinction," she said. "Most important ones are." He turned back to the window and was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I went to a funeral today." He hadn't planned to say it. He'd planned to say something neutral. Or nothing. It came out flat and plain. The way true things do when you've been carrying them too long. Mara didn't react dramatically. She didn't say she was sorry. It didn't shift in her seat. Didn't do the small performance of sympathy that people did when they didn't know what else to do. She just said, "I know," quietly, and kept driving. Cole said, "How did you know?" she said. "Black shirt. Black pants. No tie. Which means you loosened it in the parking lot and put it in your pocket. You've been rubbing your right thumb against your left palm since you got in the car. And you've been on this highway for 40 minutes without calling anyone." He looked down at his hands. He was, in fact, doing the thing with his thumb. He stopped. She said, I didn't mean to make you self-conscious. He said, It's fine. A pause. He said, He was my father. She said, Okay, just that. Okay, not as dismissal, but as receipt. As in, I have that now. I'll hold it. He didn't know why that made it easier to breathe. But it did. The road curved left and the lake came fully into view, flat and gray-green in the afternoon light, ringed by low trees and a gravel pullout with a hand-painted wooden sign that said Vince's EST, 1987. Mara turned in without hesitating. Cole said, Is this the place? She said. This is the place. And parked the car. And the engine went quiet. And for a moment, neither of them moved. Just sat in the settling silence of a car that has stopped after a long drive. With the lake outside the windshield, looking like something from a photograph taken before either of them was born. Vince's was not a restaurant in any formal sense. It was a building that had started life as a boat shed and been slowly converted over the decades into something that served food. The walls still showed the original. Corrugated metal in places. Painted over in a particular shade of green that had probably been chosen from a can at a hardware store sometime in the 90s. And the menu was written on a whiteboard in marker that someone had clearly been updating for years, crossing out and rewriting until the whiteboard had a palimpsest quality, old prices ghosting through the new ones. There were 6 tables inside and 4 on the wooden deck that extended over the water. Mara walked in like she owned a small percentage of the place, nodding at the woman behind the counter, who nodded back with the ease of long familiarity, and she took a table by the window without being seated. Cole followed her, because there was no other reasonable option, and sat down across from her, and picked up the laminated single-page menu that was tucked against the napkin holder and looked at it without really reading it. A man came out from the back, large, 60s, white apron, the kind of face that had been weathered into something that looked like contentment. This was Vince. Apparently, because Mara said, Hey, Vince, and he said, Hey, to you back, and then looked at Cole with an expression that was not suspicious and not welcoming but was something precisely in between. The expression of a man who had learned to take accurate measure of people quickly. He said, Who's this? Mara said. This is Cole. Vince said, Cole, as if testing the weight of it, and then said to Cole, You want coffee? Cole said. Yes, Vince said. You want anything in it? Cole said. No, black is fine. Vince looked at him for one more second, then looked at Mara. And something passed between them that Cole couldn't read, not a signal. Exactly. More like an acknowledgement. The way 2 people exchange a glance when they have known each other long enough not to need full sentences. Vince went back toward the counter. Cole said to Mara, quietly, He's assessing me. Mara said, He does that. Cole said, Should I be worried about my score? She said. You got coffee without being asked twice. You're doing fine. The coffee arrived. 2 mugs. And Vince set them down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been carrying hot liquids across uneven floors for decades. He did not immediately go back to the counter. He stood at the end of the table with his arms crossed, looking at Cole with the frank openness of a man who had decided that social conventions about staring were largely a waste of everyone's time. And he said, She never brings anyone here. Cole glanced at Mara. She was looking out the window at the lake, her coffee held in both hands, her expression serene in a way that suggested she had known this comment was coming and had made her peace with it. Vince said, I mean it. She's been coming here by herself for what? 4 years. 5, Mara said, without turning from the window. 4.5. Vince said to Cole, Just saying. Then he went back to the counter, leaving Cole with that information sitting on the table between them like an object neither of them had put there. Cole picked up his coffee. He said, 4.5 years. Mara said, Vince talks. Cole said, I noticed. She finally looked at him. and her eyes were very dark and very direct. And she said, "Don't make it a big thing." He said, "I'm not making it anything." She said, "Good," and looked back out the window, and Cole thought that he had been handled expertly and was somehow fine with it. They ordered food. Mara got a bowl of soup. Cole got a sandwich he didn't particularly want but felt he should eat, and the afternoon light came through the window and laid itself across the table in long rectangles, while the lake outside sat flat and patient, in the way that large bodies of water do, as though they have nowhere else to be and have never had. Cole ate half his sandwich and put it down and watched Mara eat her soup with the focused quiet of someone who was giving the soup her genuine attention. And he thought about the fact that she had stopped for him without being flagged down, on a stretch of highway where people generally did not stop, and he thought about the 4.5 years of coming here alone, and he thought about the way she had said, "I know," when he told her about the funeral, not as a surprise but as a confirmation. He said, "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can try," he said. "Why did you stop?" She set her spoon down. She looked at him with those eyes that were so dark, they had nearly no distinction between iris and pupil. And she said, "You looked like someone who'd been standing somewhere for too long." He said, "On the highway," she said. In general, he didn't know what to do with that, so he picked up his coffee instead. There was a moment, shortly after Vince came to refill their mugs, and Cole noticed that Vince filled Mara's first without looking. The automatic priority of long habit when Mara leaned across the table to read something on the specials board more clearly, and her arm came close to his where his elbow was resting on the table's edge, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin without touching it. And for a second everything in the room seemed to pause, the ambient noise of the place flattening, the late afternoon going briefly still. Then Mara straightened up and said, "They have peach pie today. You should get a slice." Cole said, "I'm still on the sandwich." She said, "The sandwich can wait. Peach pie doesn't," he said. "Is that a philosophy?" she said. "It's a practical observation. Pie gets soggy," he said. "I'll have the pie." And she smiled, actually smiled this time. Not the almost of before, but a real one, quick and unguarded. There and gone before she seemed to mean it to be there, and she called out to Vince for the pie. And Cole sat back in his chair and registered that his chest felt different than it had 40 minutes ago. As though something that had been compressed, there had been given a small amount of additional space. He got the pie. Vince brought it with a fork and a small paper napkin and an expression that said, "You're welcome," without saying anything at all. Cole took a bite. It was very good. The kind of pie that tasted like someone had paid attention to every step. And he said so. And Vince, from behind the counter, said, "My daughter made it," with a pride that was so complete and unself-conscious that it was disarming. Cole said, "Tell her it's excellent." Vince said, "I will. She won't believe you're a stranger." Mara said, without looking up from her soup, "He's not a stranger. He's Cole." And something in the way she said his name, not particularly warm, not emphasized, just placed in the sentence with a kind of easy ownership, the way you say the name of someone you have already decided belongs in the category of known things, made Cole go very still for a moment. And he stared at the remains of his pie. And he thought, "I have been in this woman's car for less than an hour. And I already know I am going to remember this afternoon for the rest of my life." That scared him. He ate the rest of the pie anyway. They were back in the car before 5 o'clock, the light outside beginning its slow tilt toward evening. The lake behind them now, and the road ahead, curving through stands of old oak and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with the particular stillness of houses that have been standing long enough not to need to announce themselves. Mara drove with one wrist resting on the wheel, the easy posture of someone who had put in a great many hours on roads like this one and had made a kind of peace with highway miles. Cole had his phone now charged to 42%. Enough to be functional. Not enough to pretend he'd been reachable, and he looked at it and found 7 missed calls from his aunt. 2 from his cousin Brent. and a text from his aunt that said, "Where are you?" Cole. We're worried in the way his aunt phrased all her worried texts, as a declaration rather than a question. He sent back, "I'm fine. Got a ride. We'll be home later tonight." His aunt replied in 11 seconds with 3 question marks. He put the phone face down on his knee. Mara glanced at it but said nothing. They drove for a while without talking, and it was not uncomfortable, which Cole noticed specifically because silence with strangers was almost always uncomfortable. That thick, obligation-heavy quiet where both people are performing the labor of not speaking, both aware of the performance. This was different. This was the kind of silence that had some weight to it, but not in an oppressive way, more like the silence inside a building that has good bones. Solid and load-bearing. Cole watched the road and thought about nothing useful, which was also different, because useful thought had been his primary occupation for the past 12 hours. Useful thought about the logistics of the estate, about what he would say to his aunt about the 6 years of silence, about whether there was any formulation of words that could make a person who had waited at a deathbed understand why he hadn't been there. He did not come up with the formulation. He thought about the lake instead. He thought about how the water had looked in the late afternoon, that particular gray-green, and how it had stayed the same color for the entire time they sat at Vince's, as though the lake was not interested in time the way other things were. He thought about Mara saying he's not a stranger. He's Cole. He thought about that quite a bit. Mara turned the radio off entirely, somewhere around mile 40. Not down off. The car went quiet and she drove in the full silence. And Cole looked over at her profile. The clean line of her jaw. The way she was focused on the road in a way that was also somehow interior, like someone thinking in a language that didn't have words yet. He said, "You do this a lot. Pick up people on highways," she said. "No," he said. "Just me," she said. "I don't usually stop," he said. "Why did you today?" she said. "I already told you. You looked like someone who'd been standing somewhere for too long," he said. "That's the same answer," she said. "It's still the right one." He was quiet. She kept driving. After a moment he said, "My father's name was Gerald." He said it the same way he'd said the funeral flat. Plain. Without prelude. As though the information needed air, and this was the only window available. Mara said nothing. And the nothing was not empty. It was full of something he couldn't name. Some quality of attention that didn't require response to communicate that she was receiving what he was saying. He said, "We didn't speak for 6 years." She kept driving. He said, "I told myself it was his fault. Probably it was half mine," she said, still looking at the road. "Usually is," he said. "He asked my aunt to tell me to call when I was ready." His voice did something on the last word that he hadn't intended. A small compression. Like something being pressed out of shape. He stopped. She let him stop. The road curved, and through the trees there was a flash of the sky going orange at the edges. The very beginning of sunset, still an hour away but announcing itself. She said, "I know what it's like to run out of time before you figured out what to say." He looked at her. She said it, still looking at the road, and her voice was steady. But underneath the steadiness, there was something that had weight to it. The weight of something she had actually carried. He said, "Who was it for you?" She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched for 2 or 3 seconds. The kind that isn't avoidance but is more like she was deciding how true to be. She said, "My brother." Cole waited. She said, "He's okay now. But there was a time when he wasn't. And I almost didn't." She stopped. She said, "I knew he needed somewhere to go. I almost drove him home instead." Cole said, softly, "Where did you take him?" she said. "Vince." The word sat in the car between them. And Cole felt the afternoon rearrange itself around this fact. The way a room changes when you finally see what the furniture was arranged to face all along. The silence after that was different. It had something in it. A warm current under the surface. the silence of two people who have exchanged something real and are letting it settle before anyone decides what to do about it. Mara's hands shifted on the wheel, both hands now, a subtle adjustment of grip, and Cole noticed that the way she held the wheel had changed slightly, a small increase in attention, as if she was also doing some rearranging. He watched her hands for a moment and then looked away because watching someone's hands is either a nothing or a something, and he wasn't sure which it was. She said, "You never said where you need to be tonight." He said, "Home. Eventually," she said. "Anything urgent before that," he said. "My aunt would like me to call her," she said. Besides that, he thought about it honestly and said, "No," she said. "Okay." And then, after a pause, after a beat in which Cole watched the road and registered that she was turning, that they were not heading back toward Selden, she said, "There's one more place," he said. "One more place," she said. "Yes," he said. "Also, not on Google Maps," she said. "Also not on Google Maps," he said. "Is this going to become a pattern?" she said. "I don't know yet." And he noticed she did not say no. He noticed specifically that she chose to leave the question open rather than close it, and he sat with that and watched the road change again. The oaks thinning out, the pavement giving way to something older and more textured. And wherever they were going, he found he was not in any particular hurry to arrive. The second place was a pull-off at the end of a gravel road that had no sign at all. Just the road itself disappearing between two rows of old willows and then opening into a clearing no bigger than a generous living room, with a view over the eastern end of the lake that Vince's had faced from the other side. The light was better here, or rather, it was catching at a better angle. The last real light of the afternoon coming in low and flat across the water and making the whole surface look hammered. Every ripple a separate point of gold. Cole got out of the car without being asked. He stood at the edge of the clearing where the grass ended, and there was a low bank of exposed rock going down to the water, and he looked at the lake and felt something shift in him again. A further settling, like a house after the ground moves. Mara came to stand beside him. Not close. A few feet of space between them, both of them looking at the water. Neither of them spoke for a while. Somewhere across the lake, a bird was doing something repetitive and unconcerned. The air smelled like water and old leaves and the very beginning of evening. Cole said, "This is where you brought your brother." It wasn't a question. Mara said, "Yes," he said. "And nobody else," she said. "Not before today." He turned his head to look at her. She was still looking at the water. Her arms crossed loosely, her chin slightly lifted, and her face had a quality he hadn't seen from her yet, not the controlled serenity of the car, not the quick returning wit of the diner, but something quieter and more unguarded, the face someone makes when they're in a place where they don't have to perform anything. She said, without looking at him, "Danny came home from his second deployment, and something in him had gone very still. Not sad. Exactly. Just gone quiet in a way that felt wrong. Like a clock that stopped." Cole said, "What did you do?" she said. "I drove. He got in the car, and I started driving, and he didn't ask where, and I didn't say, and eventually we ended up at Vince's. And then we ended up here. And we sat on that rock for about 2 hours, and he talked, and I listened. And eventually he cried. And eventually he stopped crying. And we drove home." She paused. "He's okay now. He's got a kid. He sends me pictures." She said the last part with a softness that transformed her entire face. Briefly, before the usual composure came back, Cole said, "Does he know you come back here?" she said. "I think he suspects. We don't talk about it." Pause. Cole said, "Why did you bring me here?" He turned to face her now, fully, and the question was direct but not aggressive. Because he genuinely wanted to know, not as a challenge but as a real inquiry, the kind you make when you understand that the answer matters. Mara finally looked at him, and her eyes in the late light were darker than he'd seen them. And the look she gave him was not evasive, but was careful. The carefulness of someone who is deciding how much of the truth is appropriate and coming down on the side of all of it. She said, "You were standing on the shoulder of Highway 9 in funeral clothes with a dead phone, and you weren't trying to get anyone's attention. And that's the specific kind of loss that means you don't know you need help yet." Cole said, "And this helps," she said. "I don't know. It helped Danny. I can't promise it'll work on electricians." He said. "You're funny," she said. "Sometimes." He looked back at the water and then looked at her again and said, "I haven't cried." She said. "I know." He said. "I've been trying to figure out if that's a problem." She said. "It's not a problem. It's not a virtue either. It just means you're not there yet." He said. "Where is there?" she said. "I don't know. Different for everyone. Sometimes it's a lake." Something passed across his face. Some rearrangement too fast to parse. And she watched it happen with that steady attention she had. The attention that didn't flinch and didn't demand. He said. "I kept thinking. At the church. That I needed to say something to him. Like there was still time. Like if I found the right." He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth briefly. A gesture so automatic and controlled that it was clearly something he'd done before. Many times. To stop many things. She did not look away from him. He said. "And then I kept thinking that I was angry at him. And I still am. And I also I don't know how to be angry at someone who's not there anymore. Because the argument can't go anywhere. It just ends." His voice was steady. His hands were not. Quite. He had them clasped in front of him, and one thumb was working against the other knuckle in that same motion she'd noticed in the car. And she looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked at his face and said, "You don't have to resolve it today." He said, "I've been not resolving it for 6 years." She said, "And you survived 6 years. You can survive today without resolving it too." He looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded it was almost painful to see on a face that had been closed all afternoon. And he said, "Why are you being this kind to me?" She held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than either of them had likely planned. And she said, "Because somebody was kind to Danny when he needed it." She said it simply, without deflection and without weight. The way you say a true thing. And Cole looked at her face and felt something in his chest give way. Quietly, not catastrophically, like the seam of something opening rather than tearing. And then Mara's phone buzzed. Twice. Then a third time. She looked at it with the specific expression of someone who knows the number without needing to look but looks anyway to confirm. She said, "I have to take this. It's work." She stepped away not far. Just enough to turn her back slightly. The gesture of privacy in an open field, and Cole heard her say, in a voice that was immediately and completely different from any voice she'd used with him, clipped and focused and professional Solis. "Where's the access cutoff?" "No. The secondary junction." "Not yet. Give me 20 minutes. She listened for a moment. Said, "Understood." And ended the call. She turned back to him, and he could see her already reorganizing herself. The professional bearing coming back over the unguarded face like a tide coming in. She said, "There's a situation about 2 hours from here. I have to go." He said, "Now," she said. "Yes." She said it without apology but also without indifference. The way someone says a true thing that they regret in the timing of but not in the truth of. Cole looked at the lake. And then, at here, and said, "Will you be back this way?" she said. "I'm usually not." He said, "Oh," she said. "I'll drive you back to the highway first. Or to Selden if you want." He said, "It's out of your way." She said, "It's fine." He said, "Okay." They stood there for one more moment, and the light was going now. The gold coming off the water. The evening filling in from the east. And Cole thought, "I don't want to go back to the highway." And then he thought, "I don't want to go back to Selden." And then he thought, "I don't know what I want. Except that Whatever today has been, I'm not finished with it. And he didn't know what to do with any of that except follow her back to the car. She drove him back. He sat in the passenger seat and watched the Willow Road disappear in the side mirror and felt something he couldn't name settle in his chest where the closed, compressed thing had been not resolution. Not peace. But a kind of spaciousness he hadn't known was missing until today. At the junction for Selden she asked again, Selden or the highway? And he said Selden, because he needed to be in his apartment. And she took the turn without comment and drove the last 4 miles in a quiet that was different from the quiet of before. Softer and somehow more freighted, as if both of them were carrying something they hadn't picked up intentionally and were now uncertain what to do with. She pulled up on his street, he directed her and stopped in front of the building. And the car sat idling. He unclipped his seatbelt. He didn't move immediately. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." He said, "For all of it." She said, "I know." He opened the door and got out. And he was standing on the sidewalk with his dead-again phone. He'd left the charger cable in the console, and she was still there. The car still running. And he thought he should say something else. Some final thing. But nothing came that was the right shape. He said, "I hope the situation isn't too bad." She said, "They usually are." He said, "Good luck then." She said, "Thanks." He pushed the door shut. The car didn't move immediately. Through the window he could see her looking at him. Or maybe past him. Or maybe both. And then she reached over to the passenger seat, reached to where he'd been sitting, and she picked something up and opened the door again. She held out her jacket, the one from the back seat, the floral-smelling one. She said, "Hold this." And she handed it to him through the window. And before he could say anything about the logic of this, she said, "I'll need it back." And she drove away. Cole stood on the sidewalk in front of his building for what was probably 3 full minutes, holding Mara's jacket. It was a canvas jacket. Olive green, worn soft at the elbows. And it smelled like the car had smelled. The combination of pine and something floral, and there was a small enamel pin on the lapel that said New Mexico in block letters, the kind sold at rest stops and airport gift shops. He didn't know what to do with the jacket. He stood there and looked at the space where her car had been and thought about all the things he might have said in the last 4 miles. The things that had been building up pressure since the lake clearing. Since she'd said because somebody was kind to Danny. Since her phone had interrupted whatever the next moment had been going to be. He thought about the fact that he had her jacket and no way to reach her. He thought about this with something that was not quite panic and not quite relief but was somewhere in between, occupying the space where those two feelings blur. Then he went inside. His apartment looked the way apartments look when you've been gone all day and something significant has happened and the apartment doesn't know yet exactly the same as when you left. Unmoved and uninformed. The coffee maker still on its timer. The plant on the windowsill still requiring water. The stack of unread mail still balanced on the kitchen table with no opinion about funerals or dead fathers or women who drive strangers to hidden lakeside clearings for reasons they don't fully explain. Cole set the jacket on the back of a kitchen chair and looked at it for a moment. Then he went and sat on the couch. He sat there in the silence of his apartment and did nothing. He did not turn on the television or find his charger or return his aunt's calls or eat anything or take off his good black shirt. He sat, and the apartment was quiet. And outside the window the street was doing what streets do in early evening. A car going by. Someone walking a dog. The ordinary business of a Tuesday continuing in complete indifference to the fact that Cole Mercer had buried his father today and had also somehow had the strangest afternoon of his adult life. And these two facts were sitting in him at the same time. The grief and the whatever the other thing was occupying the same space and not quite fitting, like two objects put into a container that was built for one. He looked at the jacket on the chair. He thought about Mara saying, "I'll need it back." He thought about the specific logic of leaving something valuable with a person you've just met and will not see again unless one of you engineers a reason to. He thought about this logic for quite a while, turning it over, examining it from different angles. And the more he examined it, the more certain he became that the jacket was not an accident. Mara Solis did not seem like a person who left things behind by accident. She had driven his entire route today with the intentionality of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. The charger offered before he asked. The radio turned down without discussion. The soup at Vince's. The pie. The lake. The clearing. The 2 hours she did not have to spend on a stranger's grief. None of it was accident. The jacket was a door. And it had been left open on purpose. And Cole sat on his couch in the early evening and felt the full weight of this. And felt, underneath the weight, something that was unmistakably and alarmingly like hope. He pressed his hands against his knees. He breathed in. He breathed out. And then, without any particular decision being made, he started to cry. It didn't come with noise or drama. It came the way Mara had said things came when you're there. You'll know. His face went hot, and his eyes went wet, and he put one hand over his face and sat in his apartment and cried for his father, who had asked him to call when he was ready and whom he had not called, and for the 6 years of silence that he'd told himself was righteous and which had been, at least half of it, just fear, and for the particular tragedy of running out of time before the words you needed were ready. He cried for Gerald Mercer, who had apparently asked about him at the end, which his aunt had told him in the parking lot of the church in a voice that did not intend to be cruel and had been anyway. He cried until the crying slowed down on its own, the way it does when it has finished its work. And then he sat in the quiet of his apartment with his face wet and something in his chest that was sore and also, somehow, less compressed than it had been all day, as if the grief had been taking up space that the crying had partially cleared. He looked up. The jacket was still on the chair. He got up, slowly, and went and got a glass of water, and drank it standing at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the street, and the world outside was doing fine. And he thought, I'm going to have to figure out how to find her. He was not certain he had enough to go on. He was certain he was going to try. He found his charger in his bag. He'd had one all along, tucked in the inner pocket with his keys, which he realized with a specific embarrassment that was also faintly funny in the way certain embarrassments are funny once the crisis has passed. He plugged in his phone. He called his aunt and talked for 20 minutes, mostly listening while she talked about the service and the flower arrangements and who had been there and what people had said. All the information that funerals generate in their wake. And he listened with more patience than he'd expected to have, because the afternoon had done something to his chest that made patience more available than it usually was. He told her he was fine. He told her the ride home had been okay. She asked with who, and he said a friend. And the word friend surprised him as he said it, because it was not inaccurate, but it was also not sufficient. And he filed that inadequacy away for later consideration. He called Brent, talked for 10 minutes about nothing, and said goodnight, and sat back down on the couch with his half-charged phone and the jacket on the chair and thought about what he had to go on. Her name, her car, make and color, but no plate. Vince, which was real and findable. The disaster coordination work, the brother named Danny, New Mexico. From the pin, but that could be a souvenir. He turned this information over like someone counting currency in a foreign denomination, trying to establish its value. He found Vince's online with less effort than he'd expected. The place had a listing. Sparsa, but real. 4.5 stars. 12 reviews. One of which said best peach pie in the state. Worth the drive. Which Cole thought about for a second. He found the phone number. He looked at it. He thought this is either a reasonable thing to do or a very strange thing to do. And he was genuinely unsure which. And then he thought about Mara handing him the jacket through the car window with the calm of someone making a calculated move on a chessboard. And he thought, she left me the opening. He dialed. The phone rang 4 times and then Vince picked up and said, Vince. In the tone of someone answering a phone while doing 3 other things. Cole said, "This is Cole. I was in earlier today. With Mara." A pause. Vince said, "Yeah. I know who you are." Cole said, "I have her jacket. Is there any way you could?" And Vince interrupted him and said, "Hold on," and put the phone down. And Cole heard the muffled sound of a conversation happening somewhere in the restaurant, too quiet to make out. And then Vince came back on and said, "She says she'll be back Saturday to pick it up. Noon. If you want to bring it." Cole closed his eyes. He said, "Tell her I'll bring it." Vince said, "She'll be expecting it at noon." And the particular emphasis on expecting it told Cole that this, too, was calculated. That Mara had picked up the phone from Vince's hand and given this answer already knowing what it meant. Already knowing he would call. Because she was the kind of person who looked at a stranger on a highway and understood exactly what they needed. And apparently that skill extended beyond grief. He said, "Thanks, Vince." Vince said, "Don't be late," and hung up. Cole set the phone down. He looked at the jacket on the chair. He looked at it for a long time in the quiet of his apartment. In the particular quiet of an evening that had held more than evenings usually hold. And he felt something that was new and also very old, the specific quality of having something to look forward to, modest and real. The way a single point of light on a very dark road is modest and is also everything you need. Saturday. Noon. He would drive back out on Highway 9, past the guardrails that were too low on the north side, past the billboard for the mattress store and the faded water tower, and he would turn down the road toward the lake, and he would walk into Vince's with a canvas jacket over his arm, and she would be there, and whatever happened after that would happen after that. He was, for the first time since he'd stood in the church parking lot that morning, not afraid of the next thing. He picked up the jacket and held it for a moment. This ordinary thing that was not an accident. This door left open by a woman who knew when someone needed to be taken somewhere other than home. He folded it carefully over the back of the chair. He went to get something to eat. Outside the window, the street went on doing what streets do. He went to sleep that night with the curtains open and the room quiet. And the last thing he thought before he slept was not about his father, or the church, or the 6 years. It was a flat gray-green lake in the afternoon light, and the sound of a door opening, and the word Saturday. There's a version of this story where love arrives the way it does in movies, sudden, orchestral, certain. A stranger picks you up and you fall. Right there on the highway shoulder. Done and finished. Fate confirmed. That's not what this is. What this is simpler and stranger. A woman who learned, once, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to not drive them home. A man who needed a lake he didn't know he needed. At exactly the hour when not knowing was the whole problem. Not fate. Not coincidence. Entirely. Just attention, the rare kind. The kind that sees someone standing too long in the wrong place and understands, without asking, that what they need is not to be returned to where they came from, but to be taken. Briefly, somewhere they didn't know existed. Cole drove to Vince's on Saturday. He was 7 minutes early. She was already there. Have you ever had someone take you somewhere you didn't know you needed to go, and did you ever tell them what it meant?